Old Testament Basics, Lesson 4, The Beginnings Era. The Bible opens with the simple fact that in the beginning, God created. The Bible doesn't defend or debate the idea that God created the universe. It just presents it as fact and moves on to tell the story of God's relationship with the people He created. In Lesson 4, we focus on how God got things started. We'll survey the Bible story from Adam and Eve to Israel's preparation to enter their promised land. There are many details in the Old Testament, and without a way to organize these details, the stories and characters get confused. Think of this Old Testament Basics course as building a mental file cabinet on the Old Testament. Each of the 4 eras is like a file drawer. When you hear a name or a story from the Old Testament, you will know what era it fits into and how it contributes to Israel's story. This lesson focuses on the era of the beginnings and includes Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers, the first 3 time books. The story moves from Adam and Eve to the end of Israel's wilderness wanderings, recorded in Numbers. The story begins in Genesis, and we divide the book's 50 chapters into 2 segments. Genesis 1 through 11 tells about the beginning of the heavens and the earth, and Genesis 12 through 50 tells us about Israel's beginning. It's important to remember that Moses most likely wrote Genesis to Israel around the time of the Exodus event to help the people understand who God was and how they should relate to Him. Only when we understand Genesis' purpose can we make sense of its contents. In one sense, we can say that the beginning that mattered most to Moses' listeners and readers was the beginning of their own story, recorded in Genesis 12 through 50. Israel's story begins with Abraham in Genesis 12, and the rest of the Old Testament is about them. But for Israel's history, recorded in Genesis 12 through 50, to make its intended impact on Moses' generation, Genesis explains why God chose their father Abraham and his descendants to be His special people, and why it mattered so much for them to live up to their God-ordained destiny. First, Genesis 1 through 11 established Yahweh, Israel's God, as the supreme ruler of everything in heaven and earth. The world and its people belong to Him because He created them. Israel need not fear the Egyptians or the Canaanites because God created and rules over them too. Second, these 11 chapters describe all humans as special objects of God's creation. Third, Genesis 3 tells us that the intimacy between God and His creation was fractured by the disobedience of the first people He created and the devastating results of their fall into sin. Then, Genesis 4 through 11 describes the extent of human rebellion. Cain, one of Adam and Eve's sons, murdered his brother Abel, and then, rather than repent, he went out from the presence of the Lord. More than just a Bible story, Cain's rebellion tells us that the results of Adam and Eve's sin extended to their sons and to the whole human race. Humanity's downward spiral into disobedience continued until Genesis 6:5 tells us, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually." Notice that in this summary verse, Moses is repeated how thoroughly sin had permeated the human race. In response, Genesis 6 and 7 tells us, "The Lord was sorry that He had made man on the earth, and He was grieved in His heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, for man to animals, to creeping things, and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. God decided to begin again with Noah and his family by sending a flood. In Genesis 9, he made a covenant with Noah, just as he did with Adam in Genesis 2. But then we learn that one of Noah's sons violated that covenant, and the story of man's defiance against God and his continued degeneration sin culminated with the story of the Tower of Babel in Genesis